it's important to understand that the Pakistan-Afghanistan bilateral relationship is a complex one and a strained one. And I'll go up to, since you're talking about transit trade, we need to understand this when we're talking about the dynamics. And I think the unfortunate part about this relationship is that the crux of the strained relationship is embedded in three important things. Number one is that both countries have not been able to address historical bilateral irritants. And one of those irritants is the border. Number two is the fact that we haven't been able to deliver. We've had unfulfilled expectations on both sides. And the last and very important factor is that we've always viewed the relationship through a very narrow prism of security. And as a result, the relationship has not been able to develop as it should have been over the past, 60, 70 years. And that's why we're seeing troubles again on the border. Whenever there is tensions erupt in the relationship, what do both countries do? There is no framework to go back to try and solve the issue. And hence the approach has always been very limited and transactory. And therefore, I feel it is so important for Pakistan and Afghanistan. We talk about interdependence. What interdependence when you don't even have a bilateral framework to go back to? Now, I'm sure many of you know this, that Iran has a strategic partnership agreement with Afghanistan. And even though the Taliban are now in power, that is still intact. And the problems that have erupted bilaterally between Iran and Afghanistan, they've been able to go back to that framework. Similarly, India signed a strategic partnership framework again with Afghanistan back in, I believe, 2011. That is still intact today. Pakistan does not have any bilateral framework to engage with Afghanistan. So how do we improve trade? How do we deal with the border when you don't have anything to go back to? Yes, we tried with the Afghanistan-Pakistan Action Plan for Peace and Solidarity, excuse me, but again, that faced numerous challenges. Why? Because again, we were limiting the relationship. And to be very honest with you, today, what Pakistan is doing is exactly what the Afghans used to do to us. Bring the Afghan Taliban to the negotiating table, then we will talk about trade. Then we will talk about other contours of the bilateral relationship. Today, Pakistan is doing exactly the same thing. You deliver the TTP, and then we will be able to focus on other areas. And I think this is extremely naive on Pakistan's part because, this might sound like a cliche, but I actually, think that the relationship is not just dependent on one side, it is interdependent. And the way things are developing in the region, Pakistan and Afghanistan need to have some framework to engage with. And to be very honest with you, closing the border is not an option. It is counterproductive. Let me just tell you that yes, in the short term, there are problems for Afghanistan when it comes to, their perishable goods. But the Indians still have the air freight corridor that they have provided to the Afghans. It's costing the Indians an arm and a leg, but at least they're able to penetrate into that market and they're winning the goodwill of the Afghans. So what is Pakistan doing to itself? Therefore, my first recommendation, and this is something, Kamar, I've been saying for quite some time, that pending, initially it was with the Ghani regime. One point here, you need to also understand that the relationship that Pakistan has had with Afghanistan is not just limited to Ghani Karzai or the Taliban. It is a relationship, and we need to understand it's a complex relationship. And therefore, when the Taliban came into power, as Firdaus said, I think it was extremely naive of us to think that, everything would be hunky-dory. The fact is, you need to have some sort of a conceptual framework to engage with them, and pending formal recognition, I think it's important that both sides at least start discussing something that is broad-based and it discusses all these issues. For example, when there's a problem with the border, they can go back to that framework and try and solve the situation. Number one. Number two is we talk about, again, the border. Look, the controversy surrounding the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. We have been hearing it. I've been working on Afghanistan for nearly 20 years. The same problems that existed 20 years ago exist today. The traders complain about the same thing. We use refugees as a leverage, and I think we've outsourced it because now once you do eventually send all the refugees back, what leverage do you have? You've undone the goodwill of 40 years by hosting the refugees. Similarly with trade, the border has been closed now, I think, for the 4th consecutive day in Turham. Again, the Taliban have also said now, that, they will also close the border. Then what happens? What's the leverage that you have over them? Therefore, I think we really need to revisit our policies. And what is it that we expect from Afghanistan? The Taliban, I'll be very clear, they view you as adversaries. They're not Ghani, they're not Karzai, they're not pushovers. They are now in government, and unfortunately, many of us celebrated the fact that they came into power. So how do you deal with them? And what upsets me is that after August 2021, it was the first time where I think we had a focused policy on Afghanistan. We were following a regional approach, and we've said that there will be no recognition unless and until they deliver on their pledges of reform, which of course pertains to women's rights, human rights, and counterterrorism assurances. They haven't delivered on counterterrorism. We should hold them to that. But then at the end of the day, this is something that Amir also said. When the TTP put an end to the ceasefire, shouldn't we have had a debate within Pakistan to see what we want to do? And clearly, the military approach hasn't worked. But even if we want to adopt the military approach, how many stakeholders have been taken on board? So, we also have to take ownership of issues. And when we refer to them as the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, we are owning up to the fact that they're Pakistanis. So I think there's a lot of homework that we need to do on our side. Again, I will say, number one, there has to be a strategic partnership, framework, agreement. The words can be termed in different manners, but there has to be something that both countries can focus on. Number two, closing the border, again, as I said, is counterproductive. Look, the border is an internationally recognized border from our side. We don't have to keep on raising the issue. Why do we need the Afghans to publicly stand up and say we accept the border? They do accept the border. That's why the border is being closed. But we need to find a mechanism where they can be legal. We talk about legal trade. How can they be legal trade when you make it a living hell for trade to take place? Legal trade to take place, because there are so many barriers. And it's the same problems that we're facing day in, day out. The Afghanistan-Pakistan Transit Trade Agreement, it has expired, but it's still functioning on ad hoc basis. The same issues, if you read the reports, it's the same complaints from the Afghan side, it's the same complaints from the Pakistani side. And again, I feel that it is difficult, but if we mean business, we have to depoliticize trade. It's difficult, but considering the economic and domestic strains that the entire region is facing, this is the way forward. And one positive thing I will say about the Taliban is that they're pragmatic and they believe in economics. They're traders at the end of the day. And if we focus on creating economic interdependence, it does reduce the chances of conflict. It doesn't finish them, but it does reduce the chances. Why? Because money is involved. And therefore, I feel that in the past, it's nearly going to be 3 years in August, since the Taliban have been in power, trade was sufficiently good. Pakistan getting cheaper coal. Yes, bilateral trade was in favor of the Afghans, but Pakistan benefited because we gained, I think, transit trade with Central Asia increased by 70%. So if bilateral trade isn't working, at least transit trade is, which goes through the same route. So there are many avenues to work on, but again, unless and until you don't have a proper approach towards Afghanistan, how do you move forward? How do you talk about trade when you decide unanimously to just close the border? So I think these are important aspects that one has to keep in mind. And let me tell you, we will have this conversation next year, and the same points I will raise, unfortunately. Okay.